At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's General G. Let's begin. I heard humans strap themselves into flying backpacks and charge at small ships using their own bodies as shields. Can you believe a supposedly sapient creature would do something that reckless? Zikib's white, scaled tail swayed from side to side as he spoke, his red eyes stark against his white reptilian features. Both of his friends erupted in laughter at the mental image. Vig, his blue-feathered avian companion, threw his head back in that completely unrestrained way that only avians seemed capable of, his beak opening wide as sharp. Chirping cackles echoed across the exhibition hall. The sound was so piercing, so utterly without any sense of social awareness, that Zikib felt his scales flush darker with embarrassment. Several nearby species turned to look at their group, a cluster of Morvians, with their sensor stalks quivering in more than obvious disapproval, a pair of Kelthrans whose bodies seemed to dim momentarily, and even a dignified Archon who paused mid-conversation to glance there in annoyance. "Vig, please," Pollier said, though his own amusement was clearly visible in the warm amber and orange hues rippling across the ridges on his head. For someone with an otherwise unremarkable generic green face, Pollier's emotions were surprisingly easy to read, even across species boundaries. The biological quirk of his people made warm colors, reds, oranges, yellows, appear during positive emotions, while cold colors like blues and purples manifested during negative ones. Right now, his head ridges were practically glowing with mirth. "You're drawing attention to us. The first galactic military exposition with human participation is supposed to be a dignified event." Vig managed to stifle his laughter to a series of snorting chirps, his bright eyes still wide with amusement. Zikib felt relief wash over him as the stares from other species gradually returned to their own conversations. The vast exhibition hall stretched out before them, filled with displays from dozens of military powers across the known galaxy. The Morvian Confederation had brought their impressive graviton disruptors. The Kelthran Empire was showcasing their newly developed phased shielding technology. And here they were, mocking the humans before they'd even seen what Earth's military had to offer. "You know what else I heard?" Pollier said, leaning in conspiratorially. His head ridges shifted to a deeper orange, a sign of particularly delicious gossip. "The humans still use chemical propulsion weapons in their army." Zikib's tail stopped swaying. "Chemical propulsion? You mean like combustion-based kinetics?" "Exactly." Pellier's ridges brightened further. "Now, using them wouldn't be that strange. Lots of species keep some legacy equipment around for ceremonial purposes or niche applications. But according to my sources, these primitive weapons are still their primary armament across all military branches." Vig lost it again. His laughter exploded across the exhibition hall even louder than before. A series of sharp, piercing shrieks that made Zikib wince, and Pollier's head ridges flash with sudden violet embarrassment. Several heads turned again, but this time Vig seemed completely oblivious to the attention. His wings fluttered slightly as he struggled to contain himself, his taloned feet doing a little shuffling dance on the clean floor. "Vig!" Zikib hissed, reaching out with one clawed hand to grab his friend's wing. "Keep it down!" But Vig was beyond reason now. He was trying to speak between bursts of laughter, his words coming out broken, incomplete fragments that were nevertheless understandable. "Chemical! They're using..." A shriek of laughter. "Controlled explosions in space!" Another burst. "Well, everyone else..." More cackling. "Has plasma and... ooh!" He could barely breathe. "And particle beams!" His voice was traveling across the entire section of the exhibition hall now. Zikib could feel dozens of eyes on them, and his embarrassment was climbing to truly painful levels. His scales had gone nearly gray. "And the jetpacks," Vig continued, tears actually streaming from his large avian eyes. "Some poor human." He gasped for air between guffaws. "Strapping explosives to his back, flying around." Another explosive burst of laughter. "Like some kind of suicidal insect trying to fight." He was wheezing now. "Trying to fight an actual ship." Palir was tugging on Vig's other wing, his head ridges flashing between orange amusement and blue alarm. "Vig, seriously, you need to—" "With their soft little bodies," Vig interrupted, his volume somehow increasing even further. "No armor, no shields." It was at that precise moment that Zikib noticed the human. The being had stopped directly behind Vig, arms crossed over the chest of what appeared to be some kind of formal military uniform. The human was tall, quite tall, actually, perhaps nearly 2 meters, with dark skin and close-cropped hair. The expression on the human's face was calm, almost unnervingly so. But there was something in those brown eyes that made Zikib's instincts scream danger. Palir had noticed it too. His head ridges flashed a bright cold blue, pure alarm. He reached out and grabbed Zikib's arm, his grip tight enough to be uncomfortable. Vig, still laughing and talking in broken sentences, was completely oblivious to the presence behind him. "And then they try to engage in actual combat against ships with targeting systems and..." The human placed one hand on Vig's shoulder. The effect was instantaneous. Vig's head snapped around in that typical avian way, rotating far more than any mammalian or reptilian neck could manage. His laughter died in his throat mid-cackle as he found himself staring directly at the human's face from an uncomfortable distance. "Excuse me," the human said, voice smooth, with only the slightest edge of steel beneath the politeness. "Don't you think you're being impolite? Standing in the middle of the passage, being loud, making fun of human soldiers, and, on top of all of that, still being utterly wrong about your assumptions?" Zikib watched as Vig's bright blue feathers seemed to deflate, pressing flat against his body in a universal avian display of extreme embarrassment. His friend's beak opened and closed soundlessly, no words emerging. The transformation from boisterous laughter to mortified silence was so complete that Zikib almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But Vig was still his friend, and that meant something. Zikib glanced at Palir, and in that single look, an entire conversation happened. They'd been together long enough that words weren't always necessary. Palir's head ridges flickered through several colors: blue, uncertainty; orange, determination, finally settling on a steady yellow, agreement. They would defend their friend. "He's right about one thing," Zikib said, forcing his voice to remain steady as he addressed the human. "Vig was being too loud, and yes, standing in the middle of the passage was inconsiderate. He should move out of the way." The human's gaze shifted to him, one eyebrow rising slightly. "But he's not wrong about human soldiers," Zikib continued, feeling his tail begin to sway again, this time with challenge rather than amusement. "Those jetpacks are dangerous and primitive. Fighting ships with individual soldiers? That's not tactics, that's suicide." "Exactly," Palir chimed in, his head ridges now a solid bold orange. "And the chemical propulsion weapons? We've heard all about them. You're bringing primitive technology to a modern battlefield. There's no polite way to say it. Your military is outclassed before it even begins." For a long moment, the human simply stared at them. Then, to Zikib's surprise, the human sighed deeply and shook his head, muttering something under his breath that sounded like, "Of course you two agree with him." The human straightened, uncrossing his arms. "My name is Evan Brown," he said, extending one hand in what Zikib recognized as a human greeting gesture, though none of them moved to reciprocate. I can see that you three have some serious misconceptions about human military, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you to the live exercises and show you exactly what our soldiers can do. Maybe then you'll understand why your assumptions are wrong. Zikib exchanged glances with his friends again. Vig had recovered somewhat, his feathers no longer completely flattened, though they hadn't returned to their normal puffed state either. Palir's head ridges were shifting through colors rapidly: uncertainty, curiosity, defiance. "We were already planning to see what the humans had to show," Zikib said, injecting as much boldness into his voice as he could muster. It'll be even better to have one of you with us. At least we can laugh at your face when we're proven right." Palir turned to the human, his head ridges settling on an inquisitive yellow-green. "What are you, anyway? A human soldier?" Vig gave a small nod of approval at the question, his confidence slowly returning. Evan Brown's lips curled into a smile that Zikib found vaguely unsettling. "Me? I'm more of a paper pusher than a soldier, but I had my days as a cadet." The human's smile widened, taking on a distinctly mischievous quality. "How about I introduce you to a live training exercise with our Space Marines? I'm very curious to see how you react." Before any of them could respond, Evan turned and began walking through the crowd, clearly expecting them to follow. Zikib looked at his friends, shrugged, and they all fell into step behind the human. Soon the group, 3 friends and a human, was weaving through the gathering of species that filled the exhibition hall. The diversity on display was staggering, as it always was at these galactic events. Zikib caught glimpses of the Thoraxian delegation with their natural armor gleaming, a group of luminars whose bodies glowed with bioluminescence, and even one of the rare deep-think collective entities, its form shifting and flowing like liquid metal. The human guided them with confident strides, clearly familiar with the venue's layout. They passed through sections dedicated to various military technologies, shield generators, drone swarms, biological enhancement pods, until finally, after what felt like many minutes of walking, they emerged into a large open area. Zikib stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening. The space was enormous, clearly designed for live demonstrations. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species were gathered behind reinforced transparent barriers and sandbag fortifications, all positioned around the perimeter of what appeared to be a 3-dimensional combat zone. The area was at least 200 meters across and stretched upward for what looked like 50 meters or more. Holographic markers floated in the air, likely designating boundaries and scoring zones. "Trading protection for mobility," Evans said, gesturing broadly at the space. "That's the core principle of human marine jetpack tactics. You called it stupid. I'm telling you to watch what it really looks like when Marines with jetpacks fight against a group of small spaceships." The trio approached the sandbag skeptically. Zikib's translator immediately began picking up the voices of human soldiers who were gathered on one side of the demonstration zone, checking their equipment and going through what appeared to be pre-combat rituals. There were about 20 of them, all wearing similar armor that looked surprisingly lightweight compared to the heavy combat suits most species employed. The armor was a mottled gray and black pattern, with various equipment pouches and attachment points visible across the chest and thighs. The jetpacks themselves were compact units mounted between the shoulder blades, with 4 exhaust nozzles visible, 2 pointing down and 2 angled outward for maneuvering. "Those are Visik ships," Palir said quietly, pointing with one green hand at the 3 small spacecraft hovering on the opposite side of the zone. "I'm not familiar with that species personally, but I've heard they're very competent in combat." Zikib nodded. The Visik ships were sleek, aerodynamic craft, each about 15 meters in length. They had a predatory look to them, swept-back wings, a pointed nose, and what appeared to be multiple weapon hardpoints along their hulls. Even powered down as they were now, there was something menacing about their design. Gun ports were visible along their flanks, and what looked like missile pods hung beneath their wings. "Attention!" a voice boomed across the demonstration zone, and Zikib's attention snapped to the human soldier who had stepped forward from the group. The human was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the same armor as the others, but with additional insignia marking him as the leader. The name stenciled on the armor read, Stone. His face was hard, weathered, with a square jaw and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Marines!" Stone's voice traveled clearly across the space, projected with the kind of roughness that transcended species. "Today, we fight with non-lethal simulation weapons, but make no mistake, we're fighting for humanity's reputation nonetheless. Every species in this hall is watching us. They're judging whether Earth deserves a seat at the galactic military table. They're questioning whether our tactics are viable. They're wondering if we're just primitives playing with dangerous toys." The assembled Marines responded with a unified shout that made Zikib's scales tingle. "Hoorah! So, here's what's gonna happen," Stone continued, his voice rising. "We're gonna show them exactly what human Marines can do. We're gonna demonstrate why mobility beats armor, why speed beats firepower, and why 20 determined humans with jetpacks can take down 3 combat spacecraft." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across his troops. Each Marine stood at attention, their posture radiating readiness. "And we're gonna do it without a single casualty, not one, because anything less would disgrace the uniform you're wearing and the planet you represent. Is that understood?" "Sir, yes, sir!" The response was immediate and deafening. "I can't hear you!" "Sir, yes, sir!" Even louder this time, the sound echoing off the walls of the demonstration zone. Stone nodded, satisfied. "Outstanding! Remember your training. Trust your wingman. Execute the patterns we've drilled 1,000 times, and above all, be fast, be accurate, and be unpredictable. Dismiss to positions!" Zikib turned away from the sandbags, facing his friends. "Did you hear that?" he said, keeping his voice low. "0 casualties. They expect to fight 3 ships without losing a single soldier." Vig's feathers had puffed up again, his earlier embarrassment apparently forgotten. "Bold or stupid? I'm betting on stupid." Polir's head ridges rippled, showing skeptical orange. 3 ships against 20 individuals with chemical weapons and explosive backpacks. The math doesn't work in their favor. Each of those Visik craft probably has more firepower than all 20 Marines combined. "Don't draw conclusions before you watch the event," Evan said from beside them, his tone mild but pointed. Zikib waved one claw hand dismissively. "We've seen enough combat simulations to know how this will go. The ships will establish firing solutions. The individual targets will try to scatter, but ultimately they'll get picked off one by one. Mobility only matters if you can avoid getting hit, and those ships have tracking systems." Vig and Polir nodded in agreement, and they turned back to the sandbags, peering over them into the demonstration zone. Both the Visik craft and the human Marines were beginning to move into position now. The 3 ships rose smoothly, their anti-gravity systems at full power. They arranged themselves in a loose triangle formation, each ship positioned to cover the other's blind spots. The human Marines activated their jetpacks, and Zikib had to admit there was something impressive about the way 20 individual humans suddenly lifted off the ground. Jets of blue-white flame erupted from their backpacks, the roar of the thrusters filling the demonstration zone. They rose in a tight group initially, moving to their starting position on the opposite side of the zone from the Visik craft. "Look at them," Visik muttered, "all clustered together. First rule of combat, don't give your enemy an easy target." But impressive wasn't the same as effective. In his mind, Zikib was already seeing how this would play out. The Marines would try to scatter when the engagement started, but the Visik ships would simply track and eliminate them. Maybe they'd get lucky and damage one ship before being wiped out. In his mind, this demonstration would end with humanity being utterly humiliated. And while part of him almost felt bad about that, another part, the part that was still smarting from the embarrassment Evan had caused, looked forward to it. A horn blared, signaling the start of the exercise. The humans scattered immediately. Zikib blinked in surprise as the tight formation of 20 Marines suddenly exploded outward in what seemed like complete chaos. They didn't simply spread out, they launched themselves in every conceivable direction with startling violence. Some shot straight up, their jetpacks screaming at full thrust. Others dove down and to the sides. Within 3 seconds, they'd spread across the entire three-dimensional combat zone, and Zikib realized he was having trouble keeping track of individual targets. The Visik ships reacted immediately, as he'd expected. Their weapon systems swiveled, tracking arrays lighting up as they attempted to acquire targeting locks on the dispersing Marines. The lead ship's main guns traversed smoothly, following one Marine who had shot upward and to the left. But the Marine wasn't where the guns pointed anymore. The human had killed his upward thrust and fired his lateral jets, sending him shooting sideways in a direction that seemed to defy physics. The Visik ship's guns tracked to follow, but the Marine changed direction again, this time diving down while spinning. They were timed to break any attempt at establishing a firing solution. "They're not flying," Palier breathed, his head ridges flickering in yellow. They're doing something else. That's not flight, that's combat maneuvering," Evans supplied. "Every thrust, every direction change, every spin, it's all designed to make targeting impossible." The Visik ships were firing now. Energy beams lanced through the demonstration zone, bright blue lines of simulated weapons fire that would have been lethal in a real engagement. The beams tracked towards Marines, seeking flesh and armor. But the humans were already somewhere else. Zikib watched in growing amazement as Marine after Marine evaded fire that should have killed them. One human flew directly into the path of an energy beam, and Zikib was certain he was about to see a casualty. But at the last possible instant, the Marine cut all his thrust and dropped like a stone, the beam passing harmlessly through the space where he had been a fraction of a second before. The Marine's jetpack reignited immediately, firing at an angle that sent him shooting forward and to the right, directly toward the ship that had just tried to kill him. Another Marine was being tracked by what appeared to be point defense guns on the middle Visik craft. The guns were firing in short, precise bursts, trying to lead the target and anticipate his movements. But the Marine was using a zigzag pattern that changed rhythm unpredictably. 3 quick bursts to the left, then a long burn to the right, then suddenly up and back. The guns couldn't establish a pattern because there was no pattern to establish. Each movement was a reaction to the current tactical situation, and the Marine was clearly reading the weapon's tracking behavior and exploiting the 3-second delays. "It's about to get serious," Evan commented. This time, Zikib didn't ignore him, but he also couldn't tear his eyes away from the engagement. The 20 Marines had spread out to fill the entire combat zone, but he was beginning to see that there was structure to their positioning. They weren't randomly scattered. They were distributed in a 3-dimensional web that covered all angles of approach to the 3 ships. "Pattern Delta!" Stone's voice cut through the chaos, projected from speakers on his armor. "Execute!" The apparent chaos suddenly resolved into something entirely different. The 20 Marines shifted their movements, and Zikib could see clearly now that there were 3 distinct groups, each corresponding to one of the Visik ships. 7 Marines oriented toward the lead ship, 7 toward the ship on the left, and 6 toward the ship on the right. But they still weren't flying in formation. They maintained their unpredictable individual movements while somehow coordinating their overall positioning. The first group began their assault on the lead Visik craft. 7 humans converged on the ship from different angles, their approach rapid and aggressive, but still maintaining that chaotic evasion pattern. The ship's weapon systems tracked frantically, trying to prioritize targets. It fired at the nearest Marine, a human approaching from below, but he twisted in mid-air, his jetpack firing asymmetrically to induce a spin that took him out of the beam's path. The beam scored a glancing hit on his shoulder, and his armor flashed yellow, damaged but still functional. "First blood to the Visik," Vig said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. But while the ship had focused on that one threat, the other 6 Marines had closed the distance significantly. They were using the damaged Marine as a distraction, Zikib realized. The human had drawn fire, sacrificing his perfect combat status to create an opening for his teammates. 2 Marines came in from the ship's port side, flying in a weaving pattern that kept them close together, too close by standard tactical doctrine. But Zikib saw the reason immediately. The ship's tracking systems were having trouble distinguishing between two targets flying in such close proximity. When it finally locked onto one and fired, both Marines broke away in opposite directions, and the beam hit nothing but empty air. The starboard side attack was even more aggressive. 3 Marines approached in a loose arrow formation, but each one was still moving independently within that formation. The lead Marine took fire, his armor flashing yellow as a beam clipped his leg, but he didn't break off. Instead, he accelerated directly toward the ship, his jetpack burning at what must have been maximum thrust. "He's gonna crash," Polier said, his head ridges flashing alarm blue. But the Marine pulled up at the last possible moment, passing within meters of the ship's hull. As he did, his hand shot out and something metallic slapped against the Visik craft's armor. A simulated explosive charge, Zikib realized. It adhered magnetically to the hull, a small red light blinking on its surface. The Marine's momentum carried him up and over the ship, and his jetpack fired immediately to redirect him away from the craft. The ship's point defense systems tried to track him, but he was already gone, spiraling away in a corkscrew pattern that would have made Zikib nauseous to watch if he had a human's visual processing. The other 2 Marines in that arrow formation used the distraction perfectly. They came in low, underneath the ship where its main weapons couldn't easily traverse to target them. Their chemical propulsion weapons, those primitive handguns that Polier had mocked, came up and began firing. The sound was distinctive even over the roar of jetpacks, barking reports that spoke of actual physical projectiles being propelled by chemical reactions. It seemed absurdly primitive in an age of plasma and particle beams. But the results were anything but primitive. The simulated round struck what appeared to be an engine nacelle on the ship's underside. Lights on the ship began flashing yellow, indicating damage to that system. The Marines weren't just firing wildly. Every shot was placed in the right spot, targeting specific points on the hull where the ship's armor was thinner or where critical systems were located. "Hit and run," Evans said, and his voice had taken on a tone of professional appreciation. "The Marines don't stay still long enough to make good targets. They come in fast, strike a weak point, and get out before the ship can respond effectively. Those chemical propulsion weapons might seem primitive, but they're reliable. They work in any atmosphere or vacuum, and in the hands of a trained Marine, they're accurate enough to hit specific subsystems on a spacecraft from 100 meters away while performing evasive maneuvers." Zikib wanted to argue, but he couldn't. He was watching it happen right in front of him. The 7th Marine in the first group had been circling wide, flying a holding pattern at medium range. But now he saw his opportunity. The Visik ship was focused on the Marines below it, its weapons tracking downward. The Marine dove from above, his jetpack propelling him in a steep attack dive that would have been suicidal against proper air defense. But the ship's point defense was still trying to target the Marines below. By the time it registered the threat from above, the diving Marine was already too close and moving too fast. He fired his weapon as he dove, a sustained burst that stitched a line across the ship's upper hull. More yellow lights flashed on the craft, indicating additional damage. Then he was past, pulling up hard in a maneuver that must have subjected him to brutal G-forces. His jetpack screamed, angling his thrust vector to curve his trajectory away from the ship. Point defense fire followed him, but he was already ginseng left and right, making himself an impossible target. The second group of Marines was engaging the middle ship now, and Zikib could see them employing similar tactics. But there was a variety to it. Each group seemed to be adapting to their specific target. One Marine flew directly at the ship's bridge, his weapon firing continuously. The simulated rounds sparked off the reinforced viewport, and while they clearly weren't penetrating, the ship jerked in response, its pilot clearly distracted or disoriented by the impacts directly in front of his field of view. That moment of distraction was all another Marine needed. He came in from the ship's blind spot and planted 2 magnetic charges. "This isn't," Vig started to say, his voice weak and uncertain. His feathers were no longer puffed up in confidence. "This isn't how this is supposed to go. They're individuals. The ship should be able to—" "To what?" Evan asked. "Track them?" "They're trying, but every targeting system has limitations." The third group had split the attention of the rightmost Visik craft. Zikib could see the tactical brilliance of it now. 3 Marines were conducting direct assault runs from different angles, while the other 3 maintained their distance and provided suppressive fire. One of the close assault Marines got hit. His armor flashed red, and a horn sounded. He was killed, according to the simulation parameters. But even as he disengaged and began flying toward the edge of the combat zone, his sacrifice had created an opening. The ship had focused its main weapons on him, tracking him as a confirmed threat. In that same moment, another Marine came in from the opposite side and planted a magnetic charge directly on the ship's primary thruster assembly. "First casualty," Polier noted, his head ridges a swirl of conflicted colors. "But they're in the fight. Look at how the other Marines adjusted their positions instantly to cover the gap." It was true. The moment one Marine went down, the others had shifted their attack patterns to compensate. There was no confusion, no panic, just immediate adaptation. The lead Visik ship suddenly shuddered, more lights flashing across its hull. The 7 Marines engaging it had concentrated their fire on a single joint, a junction where the ship's wing met its fuselage. Under sustained fire from multiple angles, even simulated damage was adding up rapidly. The ship's status indicators showed that multiple systems were now compromised. "Concentrated fire on primary targets," Stone's voice commanded. He was flying in the thick of the engagement now, Zikib noticed, engaging the lead ship himself while coordinating the overall battle. "First ship goes down, now. Group 1, execute assault pattern Omega." The 7 Marines engaging the lead ship suddenly shifted tactics. They stopped their hit-and-run approach and instead began a synchronized assault. 2 more Marines came from the sides, targeting what appeared to be maneuvering thrusters. The combined assault was overwhelming. The lead Visik ship's lights all flashed red across its entire hull now, and it began descending smoothly to the ground. The simulation control system had determined it had suffered enough damage to be considered destroyed. It would have been a Hulk in real combat, either exploding or hemorrhaging atmosphere and crew. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Zikib hardly heard them. He was staring in disbelief at the fallen ship, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. One ship down against individual soldiers with primitive weapons. "Those primitive weapons really work," Polier said weakly, his head ridges an uncertain yellow-green. "They're actually taking down ships with—" "Blow the charges!" Stone's voice cut through Polier's words like a blade. For a heartbeat, Zikib didn't understand the command. Then he remembered the magnetic charges he'd seen Marines planting throughout the engagement. He looked at the 2 remaining Visik ships and suddenly saw them clearly. The middle ship had at least 6 charges attached to various points on its hull, while the rightmost ship had 4. The charges detonated simultaneously. The explosions weren't real, of course. These were simulations, holographic effects combined with sound generators to create the impression of detonation without actual destruction. But the visual effects were spectacular. Bright orange and red blooms erupted across both ships' hulls in a coordinated sequence, each charge going off within microseconds of the others. More importantly, the damage indicators told the story clearly. Both ships' status lights flashed red, not just in sections, but across their entire hulls. Both began descending to the ground, their control systems determining that they would have been completely destroyed if the charges had been real. The explosives had been placed on critical systems, power plants, life support junctions, structural stress points, chosen with the kind of knowledge that came from thorough intelligence and training. The middle ship settled to the ground with its entire port side showing as destroyed. The rightmost ship's tail was marked as completely severed from the main hull. In a real engagement, both crews would have been dead or dying. The entire engagement, from the horn blast to the final detonations, had lasted less than 6 minutes. The crowd was going absolutely wild now, cheering and whistling and making the species-specific sounds of approval that created a messy celebration. But Zikib, Vig, and Palir stood in utter silence, staring at the demonstration zone. All 3 Visik ships were down, grounded, defeated. Hey guys, take a second, and if you're enjoying the story, click like. The 19 surviving human Marines, one had been killed during the engagement, were still in the air, transitioning from their combat maneuvering to a formation flight now that the battle was over. They arranged themselves in neat rows, flying in perfect synchronization in a way they hadn't during the actual fighting. Several Marines were performing aerial maneuvers that served no tactical purpose, but were clearly meant as celebration and showmanship. One Marine did a complete barrel roll, his jetpack firing in a spiral pattern that left a corkscrew of exhaust in the air. Another fired his weapon straight up, the simulated rounds dissipating harmlessly against the energy ceiling of the demonstration zone. A pair of Marines flew past each other in opposite directions, slapping their hands together in some kind of human gesture as they passed. The crowd loved it, the cheering intensified, and Zikib could see beings from dozens of species applauding in their own ways, tentacles writhing, heads bobbing, limbs gesturing enthusiastically. Evan stepped up beside the 3 friends, following their gaze to the celebrating Marines. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes, satisfaction perhaps, or vindication. "So," he said, his tone conversational, "do you feel like laughing now?" He turned to look directly at Vig. "Especially you. Where's that loud laughter?" Zikib felt his tail go completely still. He looked at Vig, whose feathers were pressed flat against his body again. But this time it wasn't just embarrassment. There was something deeper in his friend's posture. Recognition, understanding, maybe even a little shame. He looked at Palir, whose head ridges were a complex swirl of colors that Zikib had rarely seen. Blue, uncertainty; purple, embarrassment; but also orange, respect; and yellow, understanding. Zikib looked back at the Marines in the sky, at the 3 grounded ships, at the cheering crowd. He thought about everything he'd just witnessed, the mobility that seemed chaotic until you understood the purpose behind every movement, the primitive chemical weapons that proved devastatingly effective when used with training and coordination, the explosive backpacks that weren't just dangerous to their wearers but provided exactly the speed and maneuverability needed to turn individual soldiers into threats that spacecraft couldn't effectively counter. Most of all, he thought about Stone's promise. 0 casualties, the leader had said, and one could say they'd achieved it. Only 1 Marine down in an engagement against 3 armed spacecraft. That wasn't luck. Zikib swallowed his pride. It went down hard, like something with sharp edges, but he forced himself to do it. He turned to face Evan fully. "We were wrong," he said. His voice was steady, clear. "I was wrong." Vig stepped forward, his head lowered. "I apologize. I mocked something I didn't understand." Palir's head ridges settled into a solid, sincere purple. "I believed rumors. I judged without seeking truth." Evan looked genuinely surprised, his eyebrows rising. "Huh. I honestly thought you 3 would still find reasons to deny what had just happened. I figured you'd say something like, 'The Visik ships must have been using suboptimal tactics,' or 'We need to see more demonstrations before drawing conclusions.'" "No," Zikib said firmly. "What we hate most are those who deny reality. We might be assholes sometimes, but we don't deny reality." Evan extended his hand. "How about we start over? Want to join me for a drink later?" Zikib clasped the human's hand. "We'd like that." As they walked away from the demonstration zone, Zikib found himself respecting human soldiers in a way he hadn't thought possible an hour ago.